The first time Cassidy Rowe walked into that bunkhouse, she wasn't looking for a home, she was looking for a roof. There's a difference. A roof is something you find, a home is something you build. And at that point in October, she wasn't thinking about building anything. She was thinking about the rain coming in off Puget Sound and the fact that her jacket wasn't waterproof and hadn't been since July. She was 22. She'd been 22 for 3 weeks. Tacoma's industrial edge near the port isn't the kind of place people talk about when they talk about homelessness. It's not the tent cities under the freeway overpasses, not the encampments people film and post about. It's quieter than that. It's just land that nobody's using right now. Chain link fences with sections that have been pushed in and left, warehouses that have been locked up for years, with the for lease signs gone yellow, gravel lots where grass is coming up through the gravel and nobody's bothered to stop it. That's where Cassidy ended up. Not because she had a plan, because she was walking the fence line looking for an overhang that was dry, and the fence opened, and the bunkhouse was there. She almost walked past it. It didn't look like anything. A red-painted building that had gone to rust pink with weather, white trim gone gray, 4 windows on the long wall all boarded with plywood that had warped off at the corners. The door had a hasp on it with a padlock, but the padlock was hanging open. She found out later, much later, that the lock hadn't worked in years. The hasp was there, the lock was through the hasp, and it was open. She pushed the door, and it dragged on the concrete floor and then opened. Inside, there were 4 bunk frames, 2 on each long wall, the kind you'd see in any old crew quarters, metal angle, iron, some of them with pieces of mattress still in the wire mesh, others bare. The floor was concrete with a drain in the middle. There was a light fixture on the ceiling, one of those old industrial caged bulbs, but it had no bulb and no electricity anyway. At the far end of the main room, there was a door, just a regular interior door, hollow core, with a lever handle that still worked. She pushed it open. Behind it was a small room, 8 feet wide, 10 feet deep. It had 1 window on the back wall, not boarded, just the original single-pane glass, cracked at the upper left corner, but not broken through. There was a plywood desk built into the wall on one side, some bent shelving above it. No bunk frames in here, a floor drain in this room too. The walls were painted the same gray as every old institutional building in the country. Cassidy stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. She was looking at the walls, looking at how the door fit in the frame. It had a knob lock, broken on the mechanism, but the door sat flush in the frame on all 4 sides. She was looking at how small the space was, and she was doing the math that you do when you have no options and you suddenly have 1. She pulled the door closed. She could hear the rain start on the metal roof. She sat down on the plywood desk and waited out the rain. That night, she slept in the small room with her jacket on and her duffel bag as a pillow, and in the morning she woke up and the floor was dry. That was the beginning. Not dramatic. Not a decision she announced to herself. Just a night inside instead of outside. And then another one, because leaving started to make less sense than staying. Cassidy grew up in the foster system in Pierce County. She'd had 6 placements by the time she was 16. Not because she was a difficult kid, she wasn't, particularly, but because the placements ended for the usual reasons. Foster parents moved, had their own situations change, stopped doing it. At 18, she aged out. Washington State gives you some support past 18 if you're in school, and Cassidy was for about a year. She'd started at Tacoma Community College with a plan toward medical billing. Then the support ended, then the roommate situation she'd patched together ended, then the couch surfing circuit dried up because you can only sleep on someone's couch so many times before the relationship corrodes. She knew that. She didn't overstay anywhere. She'd been taught by watching other people that overstaying was the fastest way to lose the people who might help you later. So she didn't overstay. She left before she was asked to leave. And one Tuesday in late October, she had her duffel bag and she had the clothes on her back, and that was everything. She'd been in a shelter once at 19, a big one downtown, the kind with 300 beds and a check-in line that started forming at 2 in the afternoon. She wasn't going back, not because of anything dramatic. She'd been safe there physically. But the noise was constant, and the lights stayed on all night, and she hadn't slept more than 3 hours any night. She was there, and after 6 days she'd left because she was more wrecked from exhaustion than she would have been outside. That was her honest calculation. Some people function fine in shelter environments. Cassidy didn't. She knew that about herself. So in October, when she found the bunkhouse, she wasn't considering it as a stopgap. She was considering it as a place to actually get herself stable enough to figure out the next move. That's a different thing. You can't figure out the next move when you're running on no sleep and wet clothes and borrowed time in other people's spaces. She needed somewhere she could actually think. The small room was going to be that place, or she was going to make it that place. The first thing she noticed in the daylight the next morning was the gap under the exterior door of the bunkhouse. Not huge, maybe 3/4 of an inch, but enough that cold air moved through it at floor level. She could feel it even from where she was in the small room at the back. The interior door between the main room and the small room helped, but the small room had its own problem, the cracked pane in the window. The crack ran from the upper left corner down about 6 inches. It wasn't broken through, but at night she could feel cold at that spot. She dealt with the window crack first. She had no tape. She walked out to the gravel lot and found 2 intact pieces of plastic sheeting, the kind construction sites use as vapor barrier, that had blown against the fence and wrapped around it. She pulled them free. She folded one piece small, pressed it into the corner of the crack from the inside, and used a strip of the second piece to hold it flat against the glass, wedged between the glass and the inner frame. It wasn't a seal, but it cut the draft at that spot. She could tell the difference that night. The door between the small room and the main bunkhouse room, the hollow core interior door, sat flush in the frame but had a gap of about 1/2 an inch at the bottom. She rolled her spare jeans into a tube and laid it against the base of the door on the inside. That was her draft stopper for the first winter, a pair of jeans she didn't wear. She rotated them out when she did laundry, put them back. The floor was the harder problem. Concrete pulls heat. In October, it was already cold enough that lying on the concrete floor overnight would leave her stiff by morning. She didn't have a sleeping pad. Her 2-shirt system she'd been running since August, and a flannel blanket she'd had since one of her foster placements and never returned. Not because she'd stolen it, but because nobody had asked for it. Here she found a pallet in the gravel lot, one of the flat wood shipping pallets, the standard 48 by 40 size, in reasonable condition. She got it through the bunkhouse door with some maneuvering and set it against the wall in the small room. It lifted her off the concrete by about 4 inches. That mattered, not because 4 inches of air is insulation. It isn't much, but because it broke direct contact with the floor, and the floor in that room was cold enough to matter. She put the flannel blanket on the pallet. She put her jacket on top of that. She still slept cold that first full week, but not dangerously cold. October in Tacoma doesn't usually get below freezing until late in the month, and she had time. She was already thinking about the bunkhouse itself. Slowly, over the first few weeks, the structure was solid, old-growth timber framing, the kind of lumber you don't get anymore. 2x6s that were actually 2 inches by 6 inches instead of the undersized dimensional lumber you see now. The roof had a metal skin that was rusted in places but not breached. She checked this during the first real rain by lying on the pallet and looking at the ceiling for wet spots, and finding none. The exterior walls were board and batten, with no insulation, just the boards, an air gap, more boards, and whatever dead air was in between. Not great, but not nothing. The bunkhouse had been a logging crew quarters at some point, she figured, probably decades ago. The land around it showed the signs. Old-growth stumps in the scrubby second growth along the fence line. The scale of the building itself bigger than you'd need for anything other than housing a crew. The building had been left when whoever owned it either stopped logging or moved operations, and nobody had done anything with it since. No current activity on the property. No lights in the main building at the front of the lot, which she could see from a gap in the fence. Whatever company had owned this had gone quiet. She was careful about that. She was trespassing, and she knew it. She kept the exterior door closed, and the hasp hooked, locked looking, so that nothing about the building from the outside suggested anyone was inside. She kept no lights visible at night, nothing that would glow through the plywood-covered windows. When she left in the morning, she left through the fence gap, and she always, every time, made sure the ground around the door didn't show disturbed gravel that looked intentional. She was in the bunkhouse, but she was not visible in the bunkhouse, and she held that line for 4 years because it was the thing that let her stay. She made exactly one error in those 4 years, and we'll get to that. The money situation was a separate problem that ran parallel to the physical one. She had $40 in October. She couldn't stay in the bunkhouse without an income, because you still need to eat, you still need to get clothes clean, you still need to be able to function in the city. The bunkhouse solved the shelter cost, which in Tacoma's rental market was the difference between impossible and manageable. But she needed cash after she'd worked before. Food service, a brief stint at a dry cleaner, some under-the-table cleaning work for a woman who ran a daycare out of her house. She had an ID, she had a social security number, she had no criminal record. What she didn't have was an address to put on a job application, where she used the address of a church. Not deceptively, she went to the church, which ran a daytime drop-in, and asked one of the staff there if she could use it for job applications. The woman said yes. That was it. Cassidy put that address on 2 applications and had a job by the 3rd week of November, a dishwasher position at a breakfast diner that opened at 5:30 in the morning and ran until 2 in the afternoon. Her cash tips split between kitchen staff, which wasn't much, but the hourly was steady and the owner didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. She walked to the diner, 45 minutes each way, which she didn't mind because the walking warmed her up. She showered at the YMCA on days she wasn't working, worked out a monthly membership that cost her a manageable amount, and gave her access to hot water every day if she wanted it. She ate 1 meal at the diner during her shift, a kitchen meal, part of the deal, and managed the rest carefully, not elaborately, just carefully. She knew her weekly spend and she didn't exceed it. By December, she had a rhythm. Walk to work, walk back. Manage the room. The rhythm helped more than anything else she did in that first year because the rhythm made the situation feel temporary in the right way, like a problem she was working, not a permanent state she was accepting. The first real test was January. Tacoma doesn't get as cold as inland Washington, but it gets wet cold, which is its own problem. Wet cold settles into things differently than dry cold. The air at 40 degrees and raining feels like 25 degrees and dry in terms of what it does to your body, and the humidity inside an uninsulated building will drop your core temperature in ways you don't feel until they've already happened. Cassidy had been adding to the room since November, after she'd found, at a Goodwill 2 miles from the Bunkhouse, a twin air mattress in its original packaging for $3, marked down, packaging torn, and she'd bought a hand pump at the same store for $1.50. She'd been sleeping on the air mattress on the pallet since then, which was fundamentally different from the pallet alone. The air mattress trapped body heat underneath her, which was the thing the pallet alone didn't do. The pallet lifted her off the concrete. The air mattress insulated her from below. Together, they changed the sleep situation completely. She understood through that combination that the floor was where she was losing the most heat. The walls were still bare. She'd thought about this. She had nothing to put on them. No foam, no batting, nothing with real R value. What she had was materials that could create dead air pockets, which is the actual thing that insulates. She started collecting cardboard. Not frantically, not in a way that drew attention. She pulled broken down boxes from behind grocery stores and the Starbucks 2 blocks from the diner after her shifts, carried them folded under her arm, walked them back. She lined the walls of the small room with cardboard, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, overlapped at the seams so there were no gaps. It looked like the inside of a shipping department, but at night, with the door closed, the temperature in that room held noticeably better than the main bunkhouse behind the door. Tested it. She had a small digital thermometer, $2 at a dollar store, and she took readings. The main bunkhouse room, mid-January on a cold night, 41 degrees. The small room, 52. That 11-degree difference was entirely from the cardboard on the walls and the door closed and her body heat in the space. After 11 degrees sounds small. It's not small when 41 is the alternative. She added to the cardboard over time. She found a moving blanket, the thick quilted kind movers use, in a dumpster behind a storage place off Pacific Avenue, where she tacked it over the window with 2 nails she found in the bunkhouse floor, covering the single pane entirely. She lost the daylight in the room, but she gained the thermal layer, and in January the trade-off was easy. She put a second moving blanket over the interior door, hung from 2 nails in the frame above the door, draping down to the floor on the small room side. This was the most effective thing she did in that first winter. The door already cut the draft. The blanket over it caught any remaining cold air that got through the gap at the top and sides. With the blanket in place and the rolled jeans at the bottom and the cardboard on the walls and the moving blanket over the window, the small room became a different kind of space, not warm by house standards, but manageable. She slept in a sleeping bag she'd found at a church rummage sale in December, a 3-season bag, not rated for winter, but combined with the thermal mass she'd built into the room, it was enough. Most nights she was comfortable. Some nights she wore her jacket inside the bag. A few nights in January and February, she added every item of clothing she owned, layered on top of the sleeping bag. She never once in that first winter had a night that felt dangerous. There's something that happens when you spend a winter somewhere that most people think is impossible to survive in. You start to understand the difference between what's dangerous and what's uncomfortable, and you stop treating them the same way. Cassidy made that distinction clearly. She'd thought about it before that first winter, planned around it, checked her math. She wasn't guessing at her safety, she was measuring it. The thermometer helped. When the reading in the room was above 50, she knew she was fine. When it dropped into the mid-40s, she added layers. She never let herself get to the point where she was shivering in bed and doing nothing about it. Shivering is information. She acted on it. She also got better at reading the room. She knew by the sound of rain on the metal roof whether it was coming from the north or the south, which correlated with how cold the next few hours would be. She knew that the temperature in the room dropped fastest in the 2 hours before dawn. She adjusted her layering accordingly. She'd add a layer before midnight so she wasn't waking at 4 in the morning to deal with it. These are things you learn by being there. You can't read them in an article. They're information that comes from 4 winters in a specific space. And Cassidy accumulated all of it. Spring of that first year, she started thinking longer. The rhythm at the diner had held. She'd been promoted, in a way. She was doing prep work in addition to dishes by March, which came with a small hourly increase and hours that felt more permanent. She'd managed to open a savings account using the church address. She had a phone, a prepaid bought with cash, kept charged at the diner and at the YMCA. She had a small library of things she'd accumulated for the room: the thermometer, a headlamp, a few paperback books from the free pile at the library, a hand-crank battery radio she listened to for an hour before sleeping. The room had become, genuinely, a place she came back to, not just a place she slept. She'd added a small crate from behind the grocery store as a table next to the pallet and mattress situation. She'd organized the shelving on the plywood desk. She kept the floor clean, swept daily with a brush she'd found in the main bunkhouse, leaning against the wall like it had been waiting. The room was austere, but it was ordered. Order helped. Disorder makes uncertainty worse, and she was already managing enough uncertainty without adding it to her immediate space. She thought about the summer differently than she'd thought about winter. Summer in the room was going to be hot. The metal roof, no ventilation, cardboard-lined walls, all of it that trapped heat in winter would trap it in summer too. She left the moving blanket off the window in April and propped the window open an inch using a scrap of wood on the sill. The cracked pane had stayed cracked, no worse, and with the wood prop, the air moved enough to make the room livable through the warm months. She kept the main bunkhouse door propped open during the day and closed at night. By the time the warmest weeks hit in July, she was opening the small room door and sleeping with the moving blanket pulled aside and the window as open as it would go, which was about 3 inches. It was warm, but it was her warm, in her space, and that made it different. The second winter, she knew what she was doing. She'd added to the cardboard layers on the walls. She'd found in August 3 sections of rigid foam insulation board and a dumpster outside a house being renovated on the hill above downtown. She carried them one at a time on a long walk back. Each section was about 2 inches thick and 4 feet by 8 feet. She cut one down with a box cutter she'd bought at a dollar store and fitted it against the exterior wall behind the cardboard. That was the north wall, the coldest wall, the one that faced the water. She sealed the edges of the foam with strips of packing tape she'd saved from boxes at the diner. She redid the window that second fall. The plastic sheeting wedged in the crack had held, but she wanted better. She found a piece of clear vinyl at a fabric store in their remnants bin for almost nothing and cut it to fit over the entire window frame on the inside, tacking it flat against the frame with small nails. This created an air gap between the vinyl layer and the glass, a dead air pocket, which was a meaningful upgrade from the single pane alone. The moving blanket was still over the door. She added a second one she found in November, layered over the first, 2 moving blankets over an interior door. Floor length on both sides, she'd started draping one on the main room side too by then, was a surprisingly effective thermal break. She tested it. Main room, mid-December. A cold night, 44 degrees. Small room, 58. The gap had widened. She was getting better at this. She was also warming the room with her body. 1 person in a small room, 8 by 10, sealed well. That body heat adds up over hours. By morning, on cold nights, the room would be warmer than when she'd gone to sleep, because she'd been in it for 8 hours generating heat. She started closing herself in earlier in the evening in the deep winter for exactly this reason, just getting into the bag at 9 or 9:30 and reading or listening to the radio, letting the room warm around her. There was one person who knew, after she hadn't told anyone intentionally, but she'd been going to the drop-in at the church for over a year at that point. And there was a woman named Denise on staff there who was perceptive in a way that people who've been doing that work for a long time get perceptive. One afternoon in the second winter, Denise sat down across from Cassidy at one of the long tables and said quietly that she didn't need to tell her anything, but that she just wanted to know if she was safe. Cassidy said yes, because she was. Denise asked if she needed anything. Cassidy said she was okay. And then, after a pause, Cassidy said she was in a building, and the building was dry, and she'd been there a year, and she was planning to be there at least another year. Denise looked at her for a moment, and then said that sounded like more than a lot of people had, and Cassidy said yes, it was. That was all they said about it. Denise didn't ask for the address. Cassidy didn't offer it. Denise did, over the following weeks, start leaving things on the free take shelf at the drop-in that were not accidental. A second headlamp that Cassidy needed, a pair of heavy work socks in her size. Once, a small battery-operated space heater with a note that said, "Take this," stuck to the handle. Cassidy took it. She tested the heater in the small room, and it raised the temperature 8 degrees in 20 minutes, which was not nothing. She used it sparingly because she was charging everything at the YMCA and the diner and couldn't plug anything in at the bunkhouse. But she used it on the worst nights. She kept it on the plywood desk. She never forgot that Denise did that without being asked and without making it a thing. That kind of help, the kind that doesn't require you to explain yourself, is a specific and rare kind. Year 3, she started thinking about what came after. She'd been promoted again at the diner to line cook, which had happened partly because she'd taught herself from a used cookbook she bought at the library sale, and partly because the owner had noticed she'd been showing up on time every day for 2 years without exception. Not early, not trying to impress anyone, just there every shift, ready. The owner was a practical woman who valued that. With the higher pay, she was saving seriously for the first time. She had a number in her head, the amount she needed to first last deposit on an apartment, and she was building toward it. After she estimated the timeline. At the rate she was going, she'd be at the number in about 14 months. That felt very long and very achievable at the same time, which is an unusual way to feel about something, but it was honest. She kept working on the room in year 3, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She'd gotten a piece of carpet remnant from a carpet store that was throwing out end-of-roll cuts, and she put it down over the concrete, over the pallet, covering the floor in the small room with something soft. She'd gotten a second crate table and arranged the room so it had a side for sleeping and a side for sitting. The plywood desk chair she'd found in the main bunkhouse, dragged in, cleaned up, was on the desk side. She had the headlamp and the radio and the books, and now a small collection of things she actually liked. A plant in a tin can that was somehow still alive because she set it in the cracked open window during the day. A postcard from somewhere she'd found at the thrift store because she liked the image on it. A photograph of herself at 14 at a school trip to Mount Rainier that a former foster parent had sent her years ago and that she'd kept in the duffel bag through everything. The room was small, 8 by 10 feet, but she'd made it hers in a way that felt real. The one mistake she made was in year 3. She came back from a shift late one December afternoon, and there was a truck on the gravel lot. Not at the bunkhouse, at the main building at the front of the property, a building she'd never seen anyone enter or use. 2 men were standing outside it with clipboards, and one of them was taking photographs of the exterior. After she walked past the property on the roadside, didn't enter through the fence gap, kept going 2 blocks and went around through an adjacent lot that connected to the back of the property through a gap she'd found in year 2. She got inside without being seen. She sat in the small room in the dark and thought. The truck was gone by dark. She didn't know what it meant. She thought about Denise. She thought about what it would mean to leave. She made a plan for leaving. She updated it that night, worked through exactly what she'd take and in what order and where she'd go first. She didn't want to leave, but she updated the plan so she could execute it in under 10 minutes if she had to. The truck didn't come back that week, or the next. She never found out definitively what it was. Maybe an inspection, maybe a property assessment. maybe something routine. But after that, she slept lighter, not panicked, just alert. The difference between not thinking about it and making sure you won't be caught is a real difference. And she'd gotten comfortable with the former. She moved back to the latter after the truck, or it happened once more, in year 4. A different truck, same main building. She watched it from a safe distance through the fence gap, waited until it left, went about her day. Nothing followed. She never got found. Year 4 was the year it started to end, but not badly. She hit her number in the spring of year 4. First, last, deposit, the amount it would take to get into an apartment in Tacoma. She'd been checking listings for months, not obsessively, but steadily, watching what was available, at what price, in which neighborhoods. She knew what the market looked like, or she'd narrowed it to 3 neighborhoods that were close to the transit line she'd need to keep the job, and had units within her budget. She didn't leave the bunkhouse immediately when she hit the number. She spent another 2 months saving more cushion, because she'd learned from watching other people fail at transitions that the moment you hit the minimum is not the moment to jump. The moment to jump is when you have enough to absorb the first unexpected thing that happens, because one unexpected thing will always happen. She moved into a studio apartment in June, at the end of her 4th year in the bunkhouse. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on the east side of downtown, 1 room plus a bathroom, a window with a view of the roof of the building next door. It was the first time she'd had her name on a lease. She was 26. She sat on the floor of the empty apartment because she didn't have furniture yet, and she was there for a while. She wasn't feeling anything enormous. She was just looking at the room. She was thinking about the other room, the one she'd left. The 8x10 with the cardboard walls and the pallet and the air mattress and the thermometer on the desk and the plant in the tin can on the windowsill. She'd taken the photograph of Mount Rainier. She'd taken the postcard. She'd taken the radio and the thermometer and the headlamp. She'd left the plant. She'd put the tin can on the windowsill of the small room and opened the window as far as it went and left it there. It was June. The plant would be fine. What she built in that room was not complicated. That's the thing you'd expect to be different than it actually is. You'd expect the lesson to be technical or sophisticated, and it wasn't. The lesson was just: you can make more out of less than you think, if you think carefully, and you don't panic, and you keep showing up. She sealed the gaps. She broke contact with the cold floor. She added layers to the walls one at a time. She kept the small space warm with nothing more than what she could carry out of dumpsters and donation bins and rummage sales. She built a rhythm around the work, and the YMCA and the diner and the drop-in, and she held the rhythm through 4 winters without collapsing it. She was not lucky. Particularly, she didn't find a windfall or get a miraculous intervention. Denise left things on the shelf. The space heater mattered, but mostly she just made the room work by paying attention to it and not looking away from the things that needed solving. She knows something now that she didn't know at 22, which is that the worst part of that period was not the cold and not the risk and not the boredom of the long winter nights. The worst part was not knowing how long it would be. You can manage almost anything if you know it has an end. What's hard is managing it when the end is a number you haven't saved yet, a timeline you're building in real time, something you can see getting closer every week but can't put a fixed date on. She put a fixed date on it when she hit the number. She kept the date to herself because she'd learned by then that announcing things before they happen is a way of spending the feeling of having done them before you've actually done them. She just worked the remaining 2 months and moved in June and sat on the floor of the empty studio and looked at the room. She was 26. She'd found the bunkhouse at 22. She had 4 winters in an 8x10 room, sealed with cardboard and moving blankets, and a pallet and an air mattress and a thermometer on the desk. She thinks about that room sometimes. She doesn't miss it, but she doesn't dismiss it either. It was the place where she got her footing, and footing is the thing that comes before everything else. That's it. That's the whole thing. You find the room, you seal the room, you stay in the room until you don't need to anymore.